Good morning, guys. How are y'all this morning? I hope everybody's doing well. We're going to finish up our review information with the next few slides. And I hope that, again, if you have questions, please contact me. I would love to answer any questions that you have. I will try to find anything. If I don't know it, I will definitely try to find it for you. That's always going to be the case. So let's go ahead and get started and finish up this last part of your review. So we've looked at how our country basically was started. So we've gone from the very beginning to the creation of the U.S. Constitution. So now what we have is we have a law of the land. We know that individual rights are protected with the Bill of Rights that has been added to the U.S. Constitution. And now that we have the Constitution, you really have to you have to look at what is it that we're going to do to help our country grow, right? So you can't just have a country and not expect it to grow. It has to grow and develop some way. Otherwise, it's going to die. So we are a young republic. Remember, we have established a government of a republic. George Washington, who was the commander of the Continental Army during the American Revolution, is going to be elected as our first president of the United States in 1789. Now, George Washington is amazing. And when you get to know me, you're going to find out he's one of my absolute favorite historical figures, because with George Washington, you have someone who is intelligent, someone who is a natural leader of men, and he's also someone who's humble. And so you don't get that combination very often. And he has all these great, amazing characteristics to him. Now, is he perfect? No, because he's a human being, and no human being is perfect. But he's one of my favorites. And so what you see with George Washington, he's elected the first president. He actually didn't want this. When the war was over, he had not, during the Revolution, he had not been able to spend much time at his home, which is Mount Vernon, and he loved being at home. He loved being a farmer and a geologist, and he was someone who was constantly trying to find new ways of farming and creating, and he was just very someone who was very attached to his way of life, and being president was not something that he was really seeking out. The reason he accepted the nomination as our first president is because he didn't really believe, or he did believe, that he was the person that was going to have to do this, right? And so he thought he was the right person for the job. And we as a nation owe a ton of gratitude to George Washington, because as becoming the first president, everything he did, because he was the first, set a precedent for every single president that followed him. And he knew that. He was very much aware that the things he did in office as president of the United States was something that other presidents would follow. And so he wanted to make sure that he set up an office that was true to the ideals of the Constitution and true to the ideals of liberty and this idea of a republic. So one of the first things they tried to figure out is what kind of title he was going to have. And people kept giving him all these different titles, and none of them fit. He didn't want anything that was used in the British government. He really didn't want those that were used in the courts of the monarchs and those types of things. And so eventually they settled on something really simple: Mr. President. Mr. President. And so he becomes the first president of the United States. And they wanted him to continue to be president even after he decided he'd been in office long enough. So he was elected, then he was reelected, and then they wanted him to run for a third term. Okay, so remember, you have four years per term. So he'd been in office for 8 years because he'd served 2 terms. And he decided that was enough. this young republic needed to show that it could transfer power from one leader to the other peacefully. And so when they asked him to run again, he told them no. I will not run again. You will have to have an election, and you are going to have to elect a second president, because we have to be able to show that we can do this peacefully, that one person isn't going to have all the power. Now, how humble of a person does it take to be willing to relinquish the amount of power that George Washington relinquished that day? So we will have an election. For the very first time, we'll see one president leave office and another president come into office based on an election, not a war, not an uprising, an election. And so it sets the tone for how we are going to change power within our executive branch as new presidents are elected. Now remember, in this time period, there's no rule, no law about how many times you can run. Like he could have run 10 times if he wanted to. He wasn't old enough, he was too old to do that, but he could have run 3 or 4 more times if he had wanted to. But he understood the importance of allowing for that transfer of power. So here we have this young nation. We've successfully transferred power. We threw an election to a new president. So John Adams is going to be our second president of the United States. We'll see in the election of 1800, something happens in our country where we start to see the emergence of political parties. Now, these aren't our political parties today, even though some of the names sound similar. They're completely different political parties. George Washington, in his farewell address, as he was leaving office, he gave a farewell address. He warned against political parties. And he said that political parties would be detrimental to the power structure. It would be detrimental to the elections that would take place in our republic. And eventually we will see, if you skip forward all the way to the 21st century to 2020, you can say he's 100% right. So he warned that these political parties were not good for America. But nevertheless, in 1800, we see the emergence of political parties. We have the Federalist, we have the Republican, and then we have the Democratic Republicans. All right. So yeah, it could get very confusing because they're all kind of using the same terminology. But these political parties are established, and people began to vote for political parties instead of voting for individuals, which I think is what Washington was talking about. That's detrimental to our system because we're not voting on this individual, we're voting for the party that they represent. And you can see how in our today, how that could be something that's detrimental. But anyway, we still have the election or the emergence of these political parties in 1800. Then our country is going to end up in its first war since the Revolution, called the War of 1812. This is going to be a war between the United States and guess who? Great Britain. Great Britain is going to try to flex her muscle a little bit, and she is going to try to see if she can gain territory in the United States. And so she wants to try to come back in and begin to undermine the ability of the United States to be able to grow, right? Because if the U.S. can't grow, then Great Britain will continue to have power and will be the most powerful nation in the world. And so, because remember, Great Britain is still angry about the American Revolution. And so in the War of 1812, what we're going to see is, if you look at your map here, in this area down in here, you really have the Spanish that have control here. Remember, our colonies are here, so this is the United States. And Louisiana is going to be extremely important in the War of 1812. So in 1803, America has purchased what we call the Louisiana Purchase from France. So the Louisiana Purchase, we bought it from Napoleon. Okay, so Napoleon is going to sell this land because he needs it for his war effort. So he sells this land that you see that's in green, that's on this map right here. Okay, and so when we purchased it, we weren't exactly sure what we were purchasing, but we knew that it doubled the size of the United States, right? And like I said, we bought it in 1803, and we paid about $15 million for it. So we got a good deal. Now, at the time in 1803, the American people did not think it was a good deal. They thought that the American government had wasted $15 million, that this was something that was going to hurt the United States, and that we had paid too much for it. And then you have like Lewis and Clark and some of those others that will explore this area, and that's when we will realize that this is the Louisiana Purchase. We literally doubled the size of our country with one purchase. So in the end, in the long run, it was a good thing for the United States. But in the War of 1812, what we're going to see is tensions are starting to rise because the British are trying to take control of certain sections of North America. Now remember, the United States, even though we've purchased this, it has not been developed by the United States. Now, are there Native American tribes living on it? Yeah. Are there even some settlers living in that area? Yes, but they're few and far between. And so what happens is the Great Britain decides that they want to see if they can take control of this river known as the Mississippi River. So they want this river right here, and they want to be able to control that river. If they gain control of that river, they can thwart the United States' efforts to continue to move westward and to continue to develop this territory as part of America. In order to gain access to this, though, the British are going to have to take control of this area down here, which today we call Louisiana. And so you're going to see that as part of the War of 1812, Andrew Jackson is going to be a part of the War of 1812 to defend this territory from the British. He is going to be successful. And I mean, that's a whole story. Oh my goodness, we could have like a whole hour discussion of just about that alone. But he's going to be successful. He thwarts the efforts of the British. And so the Americans gain control or maintain control of this area, which allows them to maintain control of the Mississippi River. Mississippi River is extremely important because this is where you're able to use that river to get ships up and down, boats up and down, to be able to get supplies and natural resources, those types of things to different areas of the country. And so that's why the War of 1812 was so important. It's also the very first time we really have to stand up against an invading force. So Great Britain invades the United States in the War of 1812. Our capital, which we call the White House, that area is burned down by Great Britain. Our president is almost captured by the British. When the White House is burned down, Dolly Madison, who's the first lady at the time of President Madison's wife, is able to like grab some things out of the White House, one of them being a portrait of George Washington, and save that from the troops and from the fire that the British had set. So it was a really tense moment in American history where there was a really strong push by the British to be able to reclaim this land for Great Britain and destroy this new country called the United States. And so the War of 1812 doesn't get a whole lot of fanfare, but had it not been successful, we wouldn't have America today. So the War of 1812 was extremely important in the development and the protection of our country. So for the first time, not only have we defeated Great Britain in the American Revolution, but the War of 1812 is the first time we've really defended our new nation, right? So that's one of the reasons that it's so significant to our history. So we've passed that first test in the War of 1812. The Monroe Doctrine is going to be signed in 1823. Basically, what the Monroe Doctrine does is it warns nations of Europe to leave Americas alone, right? So basically, what we're saying with the Monroe Doctrine is what just happened with the War of 1812, where you're trying to be an invading force, we're not going to have that anymore. The United States of America, this is ours, okay? These are our borders. We are now a true nation, and you don't get to come in and you don't get to try to establish colonies. You don't get to come in and claim land anymore. This belongs to the United States of America. And so we are warning you to leave it alone. It now belongs to us. Our borders are established, and you may not colonize any longer. Now, that's a big, big step, because the Monroe Doctrine, basically what it says is you have to stay out. Well, if you're going to say that, you got to defend it. And so if we're going to say it, that means that we have to decide we're going to be big enough and strong enough that we can defend ourselves against empires and civilizations of these documented strong naval powers like Great Britain and France and some of those other kinds of countries. So this is a big international step for the United States. We're literally this tiny little baby nation that's just getting ready to step out, and we're going to throw out the Monroe Doctrine and say, hey guys, you can't be here. This is our territory. It belongs to us. These are our borders. Stay out. And so that's a huge, huge step for the United States to take. Now, could we defend it? We don't know. Maybe. We probably would have been able to go to war had we needed to. We proved that in the War of 1812 that we could do it if we had to. Oh, excuse me. Sorry, guys. And so the War of 1812 kind of allows us the belief that we can defend this nation now. Okay. And so the Monroe Doctrine sends out that message to the rest of the world. This is ours. In 1829, we're going to have Andrew Jackson elected as our president. Now, Andrew Jackson is important. He was a part of the Battle of New Orleans during the War of 1812. He helped save America from that British invasion. That landed him some popularity, which led to his election. But Jackson's also important because he's our first frontier president. So he's the first president that we have that comes from our frontier region. He's from the Tennessee area. So this is where he's from, right here, Tennessee. So he's from Tennessee, and that was considered part of the frontier during that time period, during the 1820s or late 1700s. And so him being elected is a huge first step. So here's someone he's not somebody that walked around like George Washington at one point that thought he was a British citizen. He was born here in this new world. He is a frontiersman. He understands fighting just for survival. And so he's one of the reasons he's important is because he's our first frontier president. Now, what Andrew Jackson, unfortunately, well, I don't know if you'd say unfortunately or not, but in history with Andrew Jackson as president, what he's going to do is he's going to remove the Native Americans and move them into territories that are specifically set aside as Indian territory. So in 1830, he's going to sign the Indian Removal Act. What the Indian Removal Act is going to do is it's going to remove Native Americans and march them into territory into the Western Plains. So basically what he's doing is there's Native Americans down here in Florida. Remember, this had been controlled by the Spanish for a long time, so there was lots of fighting there was some fighting that took place between the Spanish and the Native Americans, but they had treaties that they had signed. And then the United States basically purchases Florida. We are going to purchase sections of it, and we're going to fight for sections of it in the War of 1812 against the Spanish, and eventually take control of this area as well. And make it part of the United States. So we do have some Native Americans that are still living in this area. And so what's going to happen is it's called the Trail of Tears. So we're going to round up the Native Americans in this area, and we're going to force them to march westward. All right, so our federal troops forced 17,000, especially Cherokee tribe, to march west. So we're pushing them towards this, what we call the Indian Territory, which is going to be Oklahoma eventually. All right. This is known as the Trail of Tears because over 4,000 of the Native Americans that were forced to march died. What's also interesting about the Trail of Tears is we talk about how Native Americans died, but we also had some slaves during that time period that died along the Trail of Tears. we have the Native American tribes in this area also owned slaves. And so many of them, when they were forced to relocate to Oklahoma or to this Indian Territory, it wasn't called Oklahoma at the time, but to the Indian Territory, many of them that owned their slaves took them with them. So there was those that were able to bring African American slaves into this territory for the first time with the Trail of Tears. So that's kind of an interesting side note. But the Cherokee are marched westward. You have over 4,000 that die. This is still a moment in Native American history that is obviously a very sad moment for them. It's something that they memorialize every year. It's something that they have like different services and sections of the trail in which they march and things like that to memorialize the death of those that were forced onto this trek by the U.S. government, specifically through the Indian Removal Act signed by Andrew Jackson. So you can see Andrew Jackson is not going to be a favorite of the Native Americans. They pretty much they dislike him a lot. Okay. But you're going to see that movement that takes place with the Trail of Tears. But remember, in all of this, like the purchase of Louisiana, the moving of Native Americans to Indian Territory, the Monroe Doctrine, establishing borders, making sure that we fought off the British in the War of 1812, all of this is part of a philosophy that America has known as manifest destiny. Now, you have to know manifest destiny, guys. This is super important because this is why America expands. So when you look at manifest destiny, it's a philosophy or a belief that America is fated to grow and to reach from coast to coast. So we have this belief or this philosophy in our country that though we started in this little colonial area over here, we are ordained by God to spread from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And we really believe that in that philosophy. And so that's one of the reasons that you continue to see the movement westward is because of this idea that it's our fate. It's what we're supposed to do. We are supposed to have control of this area from coast to coast. Now, again, a lot of it's economics. Okay, people are moving westward. The same reason people explored into the New World, because you want to establish something new. You want to you gain land and be a property owner and have the ability to make money and to set a new life or a new course for your family. And that's one of the reasons people are going to start seeing westward movement. Okay. So manifest destiny, that philosophy is huge in our westward expansion and movement. Okay. And so what we'll see as the country is beginning to grow. So what you have to understand, guys, is we are established right here. These are the first 13 colonies, but all through the 1800s, we are constantly moving through this portion of our country. There are people traveling into all of these different sections of our country. You'll see the Texas Revolution that'll take place right here. That will add a significant amount of land to the United States. So there's a lot that Americans are doing in the 1800s. The Indian Wars will take place in this area, where eventually Indians will be forced onto reservations, and the Americans, the settlers, will continue to maintain and control these. What we can look at on this map, and you can see the borders. This is North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, Oregon, Idaho, all of that. You have to understand that in the early 1800s, these things don't exist. This is just a massive amount of land and territory that the settlers are moving across and setting stakes and setting roots into those areas. Okay. You also see, but by about the late 1850s, 58, 59, and into the 60s, there's some tension that's starting to build within our country. And so the tension is building between the North and the South. And we're going to see, and I know, again, this is your 8th grade history right here. We're going to see that tension is going to lead us to the Civil War. Okay? But there is one person that we want to kind of interrupt before we get to the Civil War. We want to talk about him because he is also in the 1800s, and his name is Alexis de Tocqueville. Guys, he is super important, and you need to know him. And you also need to know that he is not an American. He is French. He was sent to the United States by the French government. He was supposed to be documenting the penal system, which is the prison system here in the United States. And so he was coming in to document some of that and to write some information and some reports to give back to the French government. But while he's in the United States, he notices that America is a lot different from Europe. Now, remember, he's French. He grew up in France. So he understands the European philosophy and the European way of life. And so he wanders around America for a long time, and he's writing this information down about what he sees and his takeaway from it. And in 1835, he publishes a book called Democracy in America. And his book is something that we use today. So if you even listen to politicians today, they will reference de Tocqueville, or they'll reference Democracy in America, which again was written in 1835. And in 2020, this is still a significant piece of work. This book basically serves as a guide that we use to help measure how America has changed since the 1800s and how we've stayed the same. And when we talk about that, I'm not necessarily talking about like technology and science. I'm talking about philosophy. How have we remained the same since the 1800s, and how we have changed since the 1800s? In our value system, in the characteristics that make us successful. That's what he's talking about. And from Democracy in America, what we have are 5 key values or characteristics that Alexis de Tocqueville is going to find to be crucial to America's success. Okay, now pay attention to these guys, because you're going to do an assignment that's going to deal with Alexis de Tocqueville and his characteristics. Okay, so you have to know what his 5 characteristics are, his 5 values. He believed that America was successful because we had 5 things working for us. We had what he called egalitarianism, populism, liberty, individualism, and laissez-faire. Now, we're going to look at each one of them, okay? Because some of them, like egalitarianism, guys, it's just a big word that means equality. It's easy to remember because it starts with an E. Equality, egalitarianism, right? And so basically what de Tocqueville looks at when he's in America is Americans live in a society of equals. They're equal socially. In other words, he's not saying that every single person is exactly the same. But what he is saying is that every single person living in the American society has the ability to advance socially. And so you don't have a second-class citizen like we did in the Roman Republic, where you had those that were second-class citizens or considered second-class citizens and didn't have the same rights. It didn't matter. With egalitarianism in America, what you have is you have somebody who's born poor, and he can rise in the American society. He can build an empire in a certain economic situation. He has that ability. Nothing holds him back from being able to advance in American society. So you may be born poor, but that doesn't mean that at some point in your life you may not be a millionaire, because egalitarianism exists within our society. There's some form of equality within our society that allows for us to move within our socioeconomic system, right? And so that's what he's talking about with egalitarianism. He's not saying everybody has the same thing and that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about having a society where even if you're the last son born, you can still be successful in an American society. Remember when you were born in Great Britain's system in the 1600s, if you were the last son, you were not going to get any property, because the first son was going to receive that inheritance. And America is not based on that, right? And that's what he's talking about. He's not saying everybody's the same. He's just saying that there's some, you have the ability with egalitarianism to have the opportunity to rise within society because of this equality that exists, right? Another characteristic is what we call populism. It's also known as popular sovereignty. And it's talking about the participation in politics by common people. So even if I'm born in, let's say I'm born in Texas, okay, which doesn't even exist yet, okay? So if I'm born in that territory, but I'm an American citizen, I still have the ability to participate in the political system of the United States. So I don't have to be the richest person in the country to still have participation in politics, right? And so it allows for that idea of populism, this participation of the common people. And he thought that allowed for us to be successful because everybody had a chance to participate. Remember, guys, our participation comes through our voting and our ability to run for office if we want to, our ability to petition our government. Those types of things is what he's talking about. Okay. You also have liberty. Liberty means that there's protection against a tyrannical government. Well, remember, we fought a revolution to get away from a totalitarian tyrant. We don't want a system that has a tyrant as someone who has complete control of our system. And so we have liberty in our country. Now, again, guys, please understand, it's not perfect. We're not talking about perfection. We're talking about these ideals that America has that's allowing it to be successful. We don't have a tyrant running our government. We don't have a dictator running our government, telling everybody what they can and cannot do. We don't have that. And that allows for entrepreneurship. It allows for Americans to create businesses and create new technology. That liberty allows us, because we're protected from a dictator, because we're protected from that tyranny, because we all have rights, that liberty exists. And through that liberty comes success, right? He also talks about individualism, the fact that people are free to rise in our society, right? Our government doesn't direct our individual activity. If I want to be a farmer, I can be a farmer. If I don't want to be a farmer, I don't have to be a farmer. If I want to be an artist, I can be an artist. The government doesn't dictate to me or to you exactly what you have to do with your life. So you do have some individualism. If you don't want to go to college, you don't have to. If you're great at working on cars, you can work on cars. Obviously, that would not be an example of Alexis de Tocqueville, but if you were born on a farm, but you didn't want to farm, you could move to a city and you could become a lawyer. You could become a teacher. You could become a doctor. You could get into politics. You could do that regardless of where you were born. How do we know that? Andrew Jackson was born in the frontier of Tennessee and became president of the United States. There is individualism, right? You are free to rise within society based on your actions, based on your morals, not based on what portion of society you were born on. Okay? So that's what he's talking about when he talks about individualism. And then laissez-faire just means hands off. So the government is hands off when it comes to the economy. In other words, they're not all involved in the economy, determining what's going to be bought and sold. That's the free enterprise system. We have a free enterprise system in the United States. So the consumer, that's you and me, we're the ones that buy things. The consumer's determining what's being bought and sold and how much you're going to pay for those things. We're determining those things, not the government. So we have what's called laissez-faire. Now, laissez-faire is really true in its form in the 1800s. And we're going to ask you a little bit later, do you really see laissez-faire in 2020? All right, so where you have a hands-off government in regards to the economy. So we're going to talk about how do we apply these characteristics to America in the 21st century. Okay, and so start thinking about those questions. How are we going to look at that in 2020? What do these characteristics look like? And how are we going to continue to hang on to these characteristics? Which ones have we lost? Which ones do we still have? And if we lose any more of them, are we going to lose the success of our nation? And so you want to look at that when we look at those 5 characteristics or values. Okay, so again, that's another reason it's important to make sure you're writing things down, because you're going to need these definitions of these to help you with that assignment. Okay, so keep that in mind. Okay, All right, so we're talking about the fact that America, you started to see some tensions building in America. In 1860, we had a presidential election that was a very tense, I guess would be the right word for the election. Abraham Lincoln became the 16th president in March of 1861. So he was elected in the election of 1860, took the oath of office in 1861. Now, the reason that's significant is because of this election. Our southern states had felt for a long time that the government, the federal government, was taking advantage of them. They were forcing the southern states to pay more taxes than northern states because the southern states were based on agriculture. In other words, remember the big plantations and farming that was taking place in the South. So there were extra taxes that they were having to pay. They felt like the government was taking rights away from the states, forcing them to have to do things that northern states didn't necessarily have to do, because remember, your northern states are more industrialized. They're larger cities that you see there that you don't see in the South. And so there's some tensions that are rising. And then you also have the issue of by 1860, we are creating states out of that territory that we've expanded across North America. So we're taking that territory and we're building boundaries, borders, to create states. In the process of that, you had this idea of slave states and non-slave states. Now, in Congress, you had a balance. There was a good balance or an equal balance between non-slave states and slave states. So no one had the upper hand. But as 1860 rolled around, there were new states that wanted to be annexed into the United States, that become part of the United States. Those states, not all of the amount of states didn't equal. It didn't allow for the balance to stay. And so you were either going to have, if you allowed certain states in, you were going to have non-slave states have more power. But if you allowed other states in, then the slave states would have more power in Congress. And so there was this huge amount of tension that's constantly going on in our country as we lead up to 1860. Now, the candidates for president at the time, Abraham Lincoln, was seen by Southerners as the president that was going to allow these states in and tip the balance. And they would be, the non-slave states would have more power than the slave states in Congress. And so they believed that Abraham Lincoln was going to abolish slavery. And so they basically said, if Abraham Lincoln is elected president of the United States, if he wins this election, we will take our constitutional right and we will secede from the Union. Now, when we talk about secede, it's S-E-C-E-D-E. That's what we're talking about. Secede. Secede means to break apart or leave. And so the Southern states said, if he's elected, we will not be part of the Union. We will separate ourselves and we will become a new nation. And so he is elected, obviously. And so you started to see states, some of the Southern states begin to talk about secession. Well, in April of 1861, there was a fort called Fort Sumter. It was approached by a Union ship, which is an American ship. It was approached by an American ship. Those at Fort Sumter believed that the ship was hostile because you were sitting in a southern state. And why is this American ship all of a sudden upon them? Originally, it was supposed to be there to deliver supplies, but they didn't believe that's what they were doing. And then the ship fired upon the fort, and these are the opening shots of the Civil War. And so now there will be a war of the states, and the United States is at war with herself. You have the Northerners versus the Southerners. You have the Union versus the Confederacy. You have the United States of America versus the Confederate States of America. And so that's what we call today the American Civil War. And so that is the outset of the American Civil War. Now, I know that you guys probably spent a whole lot of time of this in 8th grade. I know they used to spend like weeks on it. I don't know if they spend that much time on it anymore. But what's going to happen is this is going to divide our country. And so this is a point in our history where we could lose what we have as a united nation. All right. And so this is an important part of our history. And so in 1863, President Lincoln is going to sign what's called the Emancipation Proclamation. And he declared that all slaves in states of rebellion, which are the Confederate states, that all of those slaves were free through the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, he didn't free all slaves in the United States. He freed all slaves that were in states of rebellion. In other words, he freed all the slaves living in the South that were that had states that were part of the Confederacy. And so he frees all of these slaves in the Emancipation Proclamation. And so that is something that is read throughout the South. Now, this is where we in Texas, we have a different date because we call it Juneteenth. And the reason we call it Juneteenth, which is the emancipation of the slaves in our state, is because when the real Emancipation Proclamation was read, it had already been signed and delivered and the proclamation made in all the other southern states. But remember, this is you're getting information slowly. People are getting that information by riding horses and wagons. We do have trains, but their trains aren't heading into Texas at this point. And so by the time those that were enslaved in Texas were read the Emancipation Proclamation and learned that they had been declared free, it was what we call Juneteenth. So it was over a year removed, about 1865, right before the war was actually over, that slaves in Texas learned that they were free. And so that's what we call Juneteenth. So Juneteenth is really a very specific holiday to Texas because that's when Texans that were enslaved found out that they were free. All right. And so we call that Juneteenth. Okay. That's kind of a side. Sorry. Okay. Kind of a rabbit, chased a rabbit there. Okay. So the Emancipation Proclamation signed in 1863. The Battle of Gettysburg happens in 1863. That's one of the largest battles in the Civil War. Huge amounts of losses on both sides. If you've never been to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, guys, you need to go. It is absolutely amazing. The whole town of Gettysburg is the battle site. And so you can see where buildings had been, you can see where they've been, damaged during the Civil War. They can take you out onto the battlefield. You can go out there on horseback. I mean, there's just all kinds of ways to be able to see the battle and kind of look at what it looked like from the perspective of these soldiers that are fighting one another on the battlefield. It's amazing. If you ever get a chance to do it, I would suggest doing it. At Gettysburg, after the battle is over, President Lincoln walks the streets of Gettysburg. He gives his Gettysburg Address on November of 1863. Again, one of the monumental speeches in American history, where you can tell the true leadership of President Lincoln. Now, when you're talking about the Civil War, remember there's two main military leaders that lead. You have the Confederacy military leader, who's Robert E. Lee, and you have the Union military leader, who's Ulysses S. Grant. Okay. Now, Lee was asked by President Lincoln to lead the Union Army at the outset of the war because he's a graduate of West Point, and he was asked to lead the Union Army, but declined because remember, during this time period, people's loyalty was to their state. So if you went to, let's say that you went to London in 1860 and they said, "Oh, where are you from?" Robert E. Lee would have said, "Virginia. I'm from the great state of Virginia." He wouldn't have said America or the United States. It kind of gives you an idea of where their true roots and loyalty really was with their states. We don't see that as much today. If you go to London and someone goes, "Oh, well, where are you from?" Most of the time you're going to say, I'm American, or I'm the United States. And then you'll tell them I'm from, Virginia, Texas, whatever. But in that time period, being loyal to your state was the most important thing. And so you didn't have quite as much that, what we'll talk about later, which is called nationalism, that pride in your country. It's there, but that loyalty seemed to lay more with the states themselves. Okay, and so that's why he's going to decline. And then eventually he will accept the leadership of the Confederate military later on. And then we'll have the Civil War. Like I said, we don't get to talk a whole lot about it because hopefully you've got a good background on it from 8th grade. And then the war ends at the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse. And Lee will eventually surrender to General Grant. Okay, so General Lee is going to ride into the encampment of General Grant, and Grant is not actually there. They had to go get him. He was suffering from a migraine, and he was not actually where Lee was moving towards to offer the surrender. And so Grant had to come in on horseback. He rushed in. And so if you see like old photographs of them, yes, there were photographs in the 1860s. If you see photographs of them at the surrender, General Grant is kind of disshuffled. He's got like dirt on his boots, mud on his boots, that type of thing. And General Lee is very elegant looking. He's in his best uniform. His boots are shined. But Lee is the one that's surrendering to Ulysses S. Grant. And so the surrender happens in April of 1865. This still to this day is considered our bloodiest war in our history because we have Americans dying on both sides of the war. And so because of that, it's considered our nation's bloodiest war. We lost more Americans in this war than any war that we've ever been a part of. Now what's going to start after the war's over in 1865, we have what's called Reconstruction. This means rebuilding. And so we're going to rebuild our nation. We've divided ourselves. We've been divided because of the war, and now we've got to rebuild it. And remember, in the war, the South was devastated. The economy of the South was absolutely devastated. The Southern states basically relied on cotton and farming. And when we declared the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, the South had been selling its cotton to the European nations. Well, the European nations like Great Britain had just recently abolished slavery. And so it became a moral issue, which President Lincoln was very much aware of. And he undermined the selling of Confederate goods and resources to the rest of the world because countries like Great Britain stopped purchasing it from the South. And therefore, they couldn't sell their goods. If you can't sell your goods, then you don't have the money that you need for not just your new nation, but to supply your military because you're in the middle of a war. And so Lincoln was very much aware of what he was doing when he did the Emancipation Proclamation, that it would impact the economy of the South as well. So the economy itself is basically destroyed. Well, now that the war is over, the South is part of America again. It's part of the Union. So we got to rebuild it because we need that economy. We need those states to be self-sufficient. We need them to be able to make money. And so Reconstruction starts in 1865. Now, there are 3 amendments to the U.S. Constitution that are going to come about because of the Civil War, and you have to know all 3 of them. You are going to take a quiz on these 3 amendments along with your Bill of Rights. The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. In other words, it ends slavery. It's not legal in the United States to have a slave any longer with the 13th Amendment being added to the Constitution. And it doesn't matter what state or territory you are in, it abolishes all slavery. Then the 14th Amendment is going to allow citizenship to former slaves with full civil rights. All right, so even though you were a slave at one point, you are now an American citizen and therefore have all the civil rights that all American citizens have based on the U.S. Constitution. All right, so the 14th Amendment is extremely important. And guys, when we start talking about civil rights movement of the 1950s and the 1960s, the 14th and the 15th Amendments are going to be used in the civil rights movement to help make sure that all citizens are going to be protected. All right, so you're going to see especially the 14th and 15th Amendments, you're going to see them a lot over the course of history. So make sure that you know which is which. All right, so the 14th Amendment allows citizenship. So even if you had been a slave, you are now a citizen. And the 15th Amendment gives the right to vote, right? And so it basically says you can't deny someone the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And that's important because we're going to talk about how some states are going to try to get around the 15th Amendment to make sure that African Americans don't vote in the early 1900s, okay? But the 15th Amendment gives basically African American men the right to vote. It does not give women the right to vote. African American men are given the right to vote based on the 15th Amendment, okay? So 13th abolishes it, 14th gives citizenship, and 15th gives the right to vote to African men, okay? Now, we're going to see a compromise that takes place in 1877, and we're going to see the end of Reconstruction. That means that the military, the U.S. military that was stationed in the South is removed from the southern states in 1877, and the states can now elect and put into power those that they see fit to put in power, and no longer forced to have Northerners telling them what to do. Okay, so the Compromise of 1877 ends Reconstruction and allows the South to begin to rule itself once again. Okay. All right, this is your last slide right here. Okay, now we're going to see the evolution of the mid-19th century America. Okay, this is where we start. This is where we're going to start the new information that you'll be getting. So up till this point, hopefully everything kind of sounds familiar. We kind of jogged your memory a little bit about some world history, a little bit about your 8th grade history, your world geography. And so you should be able to kind of have a better understanding, or, just kind of renewed that information for you. All right. And so this is our starting off period. All right. So this is where we're going to jump off in 1877 into the new information that we're going to start, that you'll focus on for the rest of the school year. All right. So our federal government has secured its supremacy over the states. Remember the Monroe Doctrine. The Great Plains are open to settlement. So we'll see our westward movement. That'll be one of our very first units that we'll talk about. We'll see new railroads crisscrossing our nation. The Northeast accelerates its industrial growth. We'll start to see urbanization, more and more cities growing in our country. People will move from rural areas to cities as we see our population trend change in our country. The demographics of our nation is going to change. And then this notion that Americans can stand together as one, even though we're very diverse, we have all kinds of people from different backgrounds, different countries that have immigrated into our country, huge immigration in the 1870s, 1880s in America, coming out of European countries. But they're diverse. And so we want to make sure that we understand that even though we have a lot of diversity, we're one. We're all Americans. And so we come up with this motto on the Great Seal. This is your Great Seal right here that you see with the eagle. It's called In Pluribus Unum, and it means out of many one. And you can see it also, E Pluribus Unum is on our money, right? And so it means that out of all of these different ideas and all these different backgrounds and languages and religions, out of all of them, we're going to put them all together. And guess what we are? We're one. Because what are we? We're American. We are unified in that fact. We are Americans, and it doesn't matter the color of your skin. It doesn't matter what your religious preference is. It doesn't matter what your, what country you may have, your parents or grandparents or whatever may have originally come from, or where you immigrated from. It doesn't matter, because we're all citizens. And because we're all citizens of one country, we are now all American. And so E Pluribus Unum means out of all of that, all the many, we have created one. And that one is America. And then we also are going to see in the creation of our national motto, you can see it also on your money. So right here, you can see In God We Trust. This is our national motto. And we actually are not going to see an official national motto until we get into what we call the Cold War. In the 1950s, we'll see the Cold War begin. In the late 1940s, moving forward into the 1990s. But we will add the national motto, "In God We Trust," to show the rest of the world that we do allow religious freedom, whereas the nation during our Cold War that we are most competitive with is the Soviet Union, which is an atheist country, right? So that's why we're going to add "In God We Trust" as our national motto to show the rest of the world that we do have a belief system and that you are allowed to worship in our country with freedom, okay? And so now the stage has been set for American expansion and American prosperity, right? And like we said, we're going to jump off in 1877 and start talking about westward movement. We're going to start talking about industrialization. We're going to talk about international changes with the United States. So huge amount of information that we want to jump off from here, right? But hopefully this is a good review for you. You're looking back at this and thinking, "Oh, I remember that. I remember talking about that. I remember seeing that," or doing a project on that and that type of thing. And now we're all together on the same page, and we can jump off into the 1870s and kind of move forward with our history from there. All right. And again, guys, questions, ask them. Don't be afraid. Always know that you can ask a question with me on any of the information we cover. Okay. All right. I'll talk to you guys later. Have a great day.